Hello, everybody. My name is Lara Coutinho Dean, and in the SCA, I'm known as Dame Sophia the Orange. And I am joined by a magnificent woman, a good old friend, Judith, who has many titles in the SCA. And we met in the dance community a long, long time ago. And so we have enjoyed much in the way of historic dance together. And she has gone on and done an amazing amount of research into cultures all over the world, and she shares them on her YouTube. You've got YouTube and blogs and all sorts of ways that you share your information with people under the name of Creative Contessa, which I think is wonderful. So, I'd like to ask Judith to please also expand on that. What do you do that makes your exploration of history so exciting?
Okay, well, thank you. That was a very generous introduction. I have a bit of imposter syndrome, so yeah. So I am Judith in Northumbria in the Society for Creative Anachronism. Many of you may know me as Creative Contessa. It's sort of a persona I've created for myself in my pursuit of exploring history, culture, and creativity sort of all together as a holistic piece rather than examining individual crafts in isolation. I don't think you can explore creativity historically without understanding the places and peoples that created that creativity. Yeah, for me, history is about people, it's about stories, it's not just battles and dates, and I think that a lot of people get lost in it. So yeah, today we're talking about misogyny. And, to understand misogyny, you have to understand the word. The word is Greek origin, and it literally comes from miso, hatred, and gune, women. So it literally means hatred of women. And it's a very hot these days, and it's a buzzword. And there are a lot of people who will scream bloody murder if you drop that word in a common conversation, and they'll protest that it doesn't exist and it's never existed and it's all made up. But there's a lot of really hard evidence that misogyny has played a major role in Western society for women for almost, what year are we in? 2024, right? So for at least for 700 years has been the trend. So we're Shakespeare, Taming of the Shrew. It's a great play. It's really witty. Shakespeare's mastery is not in writing a story, because he just took stories that were folk tales at the time. He fleshed them out. He gave the characters life. He gave them wit. He gave them psychology. That's what really separates his works from other plays that predate him, is that there's serious psychological depth to them, and that no character is really one-dimensional, not even the silly little characters that are on the screen. And Taming of the Shrew it's a disturbing play for modern audiences, and maybe it should be. Now, the question, though, was it a disturbing play for audiences in the early 17th century, which I think Taming of the Shrew was written in the 16 aughts. Actually, I don't.
Yeah, it was one of his earlier pieces.
Yeah, it's one of his earlier pieces, but I don't think it's one of the ones he actually wrote while Elizabeth was alive. But I could be wrong about that. I actually didn't think to check that out. But Elizabethan England. Yeah, so he sets the play in Italy, and actually Shakespeare loves setting plays in exotic destinations, and these sort of places and times that never really existed, but he imagines they did. He never traveled to Italy, so he never saw the place firsthand, but he certainly knew people who had been to Italy. He'd certainly read travelogues. He had certainly read reports by ambassadors, because the printing press is in full swing in the end of the 16th century, and there's all sorts of interesting things being published about the greater world at large. So even though he never saw it himself, he probably had read about it. Now, how accurate those travel vlogs were, or travel logs, there were no blogs. How accurate those travel logs were, of course, is a matter of debate. But my point is that he did have some awareness of the realities of life in Italy. That being said, his plays nearly always reflect the conditions of his world, of his Tudor and Stuart England. And so the Taming of the Shrew absolutely reflects the legal realities of women in that era. And, to understand how we got to Tudor England, where women are property of their men, right? As daughters, they're property of their fathers. As wives, they are property of their husbands, and as widows, possibly property of their brothers, if they had any surviving brothers. But that means that anything that was done to them in a legal sense was only viewed as a crime if it was a property crime. That means someone else outside the family committed said crime. So if a random man were to assault a woman in Tudor England, in any context, he would certainly face severe penalties. But it wasn't because he hurt the woman, it's because he violated someone else's property. And that is very clearly stipulated in the way the laws are written. And I'm sorry I didn't have time to get some fun quotes and read them in fun Tudor English with the fun accent. But that's very clearly written in the laws about sexual assault, about physical assault, about abduction, all viewed as a property crime. And it's not just England where this is the case. The laws in various city-states in Italy are written this way. In various city-states and polities in the Holy Roman Empire, in various parts of France. I mean, you do have to understand that Europe in the 16th century is certainly not a monolith. It's no European Union. And even within so-called unions, Kalmar Union in Scandinavia, for instance, there are different laws in different regions that are specific. So there certainly were parts of Europe, medieval and Renaissance Europe, where women had more rights, where women had more legal autonomy, where maybe women weren't considered property, but that's not the case of England. And so England is what's informing Shakespeare's work. And that's why when the husband in Taming Petruchio, right? Yeah.
Petruchio, yeah.
Yeah, Petruchio, you know, engages in some rather severe personality reformation. No one was probably aghast at that. And this sort of trend towards treating women like property is actually cyclical throughout human civilization. You can actually watch it. You go back to ancient times. You know, in the Bronze Age, women were very powerful and had lots of legal rights. And then there's the Bronze Age collapse, and suddenly it's men, lots of patriarchy. Then it kind of comes up again in the Dark Ages, and then it goes down again to the classical age of Greece. And this is Europe, mind you. The rest of the world very distinct patterns. And then, the more civilization you have, there seems to be a correlation between more civilization and more misogyny. It seems to be that the more you need women to do work, I mean real work, serious physical labor, to actually take on the task of guarding and gardening and farming and creating and being an active part of the economic model, then women have more status and more rights and even are equal to the men. But the second civilization starts developing technology and becomes more sophisticated, then women start being viewed as not a part of the machine that has a burden on it. So in the first millennium in Europe, you see that women are nearly always equal to men in most parts of Europe, north of the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean sort of clung on for a long time to its Roman traditions. The Roman Empire sort of never ended in places like Italy. It just kind of broke into small polities that continued a lot of the ancient Roman laws and traditions. Whereas where the migratory peoples came in, the Germanic tribes, steppe tribes, came in and brought their women folk with them, because that's what migratory tribes do. Their women were absolutely equal. They had to do equal work, equal labor, equal contribution. And in many of those tribes, considered more than men, more valuable than men as a part of society, because they were the ones who create new people, new life. And so in the laws in those parts of Europe in the first millennium, you see that crimes against women, physical crimes against women, even by their own men, were very serious and contained or came with serious punishments. But then as civilization starts to resettle towards the first millennium, as polities start to coalesce and cohere into bigger and bigger states, you start to see the status of women dropping. And that's also a question of supply and demand. There were more women because civilization was rising again. more babies could be had, more babies could survive into childhood and adulthood. And suddenly you start to see there are a lot more women available. And so that kind of correlates to, well, but now we don't need these women to do the work. There's also more men. So we have more people to do the work. So the men can do the work. So the women are start to be viewed as a burden on society rather than as a benefit or asset. And so in the 14th century is kind of the turning point for that in many parts of Europe when you start to see it in the literature. There's a whole host of misogynistic literature that appears in the 14th century that just isn't there before. And in the Arthurian romances, the earlier ones especially, you'll see there's not really any misogyny. Women are considered terrifying and powerful in those works. But then in the 14th century, you start to see this misogynistic literature coming along. And it provokes a reaction from women, from literary women, in fact. And one of those women is Christine de Pizan, Christine of Pizan, who was a widow, and in 15th century, early 15th century France. And as a widow, she had self-determination because there was no man controlling her. She had no father, she had no brother, she had no husband anymore. Sort of by the 15th century, widowhood is where it's at for women. That's your goal. Your goal is to marry well, marry rich, hopefully, and then hopefully he dies when you're still young enough to enjoy the rest of your life. And that sounds so cynical and so terrible by modern standards. It's true. It's where it was at. And so here's Christine de Pizan. She's a widow, but she's not a wealthy widow. Her husband did not, he left her with a little. She wasn't completely in penury and begging on the streets, but she turned to her pen to make a living. And she managed to impress so many men with her wit and rhetoric. And she wrote whole letters and books responding to this misogyny and demonstrating, illustrating very powerfully how women are wonderful and powerful and creative, and how they are an essential part of society, and how they are the equal of men. And there's actually some letters that have survived between her and men who wrote polemics against women, where she actually convinces them, like this is something we can't imagine in the modern social media world. She changes their mind with her pen. She gets patronage from the Queen of France, from the King of France, from the Duchess of Burgundy, right? She manages to make a living illustrating how women are valuable and how this misogynistic attitude that's just everywhere in so much literature by the 15th century is unwarranted. So, but that illustrates that there was a very real situation in which she was existing, that the framework conditions for her life were working against her, that she had to fight for every single bit of autonomy and legal status that she had, because that wasn't the case. If Boccaccio wrote in the 14th century a series of folk tales, his Decameron, right? And he didn't write the folk tales. He consolidated folk tales that no doubt had existed for a long time. And in one of those folk tales, there is this goof of an Italian husband, Florentine husband, who beats his wife publicly, and no one does or says anything about it, except brothers take umbrage to it, because in her brother's mind, she's still property of their family as well. So they go and do something about it. But he literally beats her on the street violently. I mean, really badly. Boccaccio describes it in grim terms. And no one responds, because that was the husband beating his wife. She was his property. She must have done something wrong to deserve it, because in all of these misogynistic polemics against women that talk about their vanity and their nudity and their obscenity, they all talk about how the only way to control a woman, to counter her natural sin, is through violence. I mean, it's the same violence they used on children, rearing children, right? And so, to a certain degree, women were considered to just be grown-up versions of children in the system, in terms of how you should interact with them, how you should treat them, how you should perform them. And that all stems back to the original sin, the idea of original sin. Right? In the first millennium, the idea of original sin hadn't really taken hold yet. It is something that kind of develops across the first millennium as church scholars, church thinkers ponder these ideas, fundamental ideas of their still kind of growing and developing religion. And that's when someone stumbled, I don't remember who was the first person to stumble across the idea of original sin. It might have even been St. Augustine in the 5th century. But the idea of original sin is that Eve is responsible for the fall of man, because apparently Adam had no agency in making bad choices, right? And so Eve is responsible for the fall of man, and she's responsible for the expulsion from the garden. And she's the reason that there is suffering and that there is sin in the world. It's her original sin of taking a bite from the apple of the fruit of the tree of knowledge. Right? And so that was her sin. Her sin was wanting to know. I mean, and also that, if you think about that, that is in itself a misogynistic idea that a woman wanting to know things, wanting knowledge, is the greatest sin that can be committed against God. I mean, wow. And that idea was, I mean, yes, Adam was also punished, so Adam should also have had knowledge, but she's the one who took the initiative to gain knowledge, and so she is responsible for all the suffering that there is. And that underpins all of these European polemics against women. And I've done absolutely no research into misogyny in Jewish culture in this era, because of course Jewish culture in Europe kind of has its own subculture that interacts with the greater forces around it, but also maintains its own way of its own approach to interacting with men women relations and that. And I haven't done any research into medieval Islamic mores and their regard of women. But all those religions all have original sin because they're all Abrahamic religions. So it wouldn't surprise me if maybe there were similar ideas that came along in the Middle Ages. But I have no actual knowledge of that and don't claim to. Just saying. Putting that out there, we're talking about Christian Europe and its approach to women. I'm not even going to get anywhere near Spain in this time. It's a mess in the 16th century. It's come together and it's got this empire thing going on. Who knows? Still going on there. It's part of the cleanup from the reconquest, the Reconquista. So what that means is original sin is absolutely still present. And in the Middle Ages, there's actually this dichotomy between Eve and Maria and Mary, right? So you have Eve responsible for original sin, but Mary, the mother of God, who's responsible for the salvation, for giving birth to the salvation of man, right? So there's always this dichotomy of the evil fallen woman and the blameless, immaculate virgin, right? And so what happens is you get this cult of the Virgin Mary that comes up in the Middle Ages. And so even though the laws are working against the women, there's still this kind of odd respect for women and love and worship of women because they're tied to Mary as much as they're tied to Eve. And so Catholicism has a place in the Middle Ages for powerfulness of woman, the mother of God, right? There's entire churches named in her honor. People are praying to her as an intercessor. They feel they're not worthy enough to pray to God directly. They pray to the Virgin to, in turn, go to God. It's a very medieval feudal concept, to go to God on their behalf, right? So psychologically, there's definitely complexity that had to have existed in this era, in the Middle Ages. But then comes the Reformation, and that's when things start to get really bad for women. Because many of the reformist denominations are exceedingly misogynist, whereas Catholicism is in and of itself in this era not really misogynistic. Men and women were kind of considered equal in the eyes of God. Yes, there were plenty of Catholic scholars and church scholars and intellectuals who wrote against women, but the system itself wasn't necessarily set up against women. But these denominational churches, these Reformed churches of the 16th century, the Calvinists, the Puritans, the Calvinists kind of become the Presbyterians in Scotland, right? And there's some really seriously scary sects that don't last, thankfully. But in the city of Ulm in the 16th century, for instance, they went through this reformist period where like women were considered that they should only be barefoot and pregnant in the kitchen, and they weren't allowed on the streets. And if they actually left the home, they were like beaten to death. Like it went through this really crazy period where women were considered to be the bottom of the bottom. And that also informs that the Reformation really changed things for women because it killed the cult of Mary, right? So suddenly the virgin is no longer an important part of anything. You don't need an intercessor. You pray directly to God. God is a man. God made man in his image. And the woman is just a rib, a cheap copy made from the rib of Adam, right? And I mean, I'm speaking in very generalistic terms, obviously. Again, Europe is not a monolith. But Tudor England is where the Puritan ethos arose. And Puritanism really, they did not look at women as being very high status at all. And certainly, spare the rod and spoil the child was part of the Puritan faith, and it applied to women too. Women being, of course, basically like grown up versions of children in their legal status. So, given all that, a 16th or even 17th century audience would have laughed riotously the way that Petruchio treats Kate in this Catherine in this play. They would not have batted an eyelash, and maybe the women wouldn't have either necessarily. Right? There are a lot of in all throughout history, and in our modern world, there are many women who are also misogynist. Right? It's kind of a Schadenfreude thing, like they've been made to suffer, and they like to see that other women have also been made to suffer in a similar fashion. And that's kind of human nature. Everyone feels that way a little bit about something. If they've had a bad experience, misery loves company, it makes them feel better when other people do. So it's also likely that women watching The Taming of the Shrew would have laughed riotously and would not have thought a thing about it. But what's interesting is the ending of Taming of the Shrew, the very last scene, where Catherine Katharina supposedly submits to him, right? There's a lot of debate amongst modern scholars whether this is actually a submission or a subversive. This is Shakespeare being subversive. Shakespeare was extremely subversive. You will notice in his plays that very often women do not fulfill the traditional roles, and they're not punished for not fulfilling the traditional roles. And that he actually seems to be rather a proponent of women.
Mm-hmm. He does have a number of really strong there, and I'm playing Kate, so I'm really investigating that final scene and all the many ways that it can be played. You're absolutely right. It is a topic of hot debate, and I'm just now exploring that.
Yeah, so that final scene, I've always read it. In my mind's eye, I've always read it as her pretending to submit, but basically sarcastically telling him, I'm doing this, but this is not real. Don't expect this to be the way it's going to be, especially not when we're in private. Right? This is not going to be our private life. And I mean, the reality is that I think maybe that stage of the play, maybe she's realized that outward discourtesy, like outright discourtesy, is not the way. It's not acceptable. It doesn't make a pleasant life, right? There are better ways to assert yourself than her sort of very loud behavior, right? That there are better ways to assert yourself, and she's realized that by the end of the play. And I don't really think that she has changed in her core personality. That's my interpretation, and I'll say that was my university professor's interpretation, all of it. Because I studied Shakespeare as part of my undergraduate. And yeah, that I think that's the best way to read that. And I think that in Shakespeare's mind, maybe for him it was a possibility he was putting all this behavior out there to kind of spotlight it and maybe make people think differently about it. But that's he never, as far as I know, he never wrote about his own work. So, who knows if that's true. But if you just look at his other plays, at the roles that women play, they're hardly ever actually submissive. They're hardly ever victims. They're hardly ever recipients. They're nearly always agents. So I would like to add something about the Taming of the Shrew.
Yeah.
The Taming of the Shrew actually from part of taken from a much older folk tale. Spanish, there's one in Spain and there's an equivalent one in Italy from the 14th century. And that kind of ties in when this whole misogyny, the rise of misogynistic literature in the 14th century. And it's the Spanish original is much rougher. This knight marries this shrew of a woman, and he destroys furniture, he kills a cat, he does some really scary things to scare her into submission. So the original story on which Shakespeare's tale is based is much rougher. And so he actually tones it down a bit. And so that might be an interesting way of looking at this play as the toned down version of misogyny in Tudor England and also animal cruelty, because I don't think Petruchio does anything to animals. Like,
No, no, he just makes her wait a long time to eat, and he keeps her up at night, and he destroys the dress. That's it. No animal cruelty.
right, exactly. So actually, by the standards of the time, this is actually a really progressive way of reforming a shrewish woman. He doesn't take the like it's at the play at the beginning of the play. He actually basically says, "I'm not going to need to beat her." Right? That will be unnecessary. You know, everyone's advising him on what he should do. First off, don't marry her. But um, second, they tell him he should beat her. He should do all these, really much more physically aggressive things to her, and he doesn't. And maybe, and I've always read that as he doesn't want a woman who's proud and submissive. He just wouldn't mind a wife with some spirit who also can behave herself, right? Like, is that a big ask, really? Is that if the roles were reversed? Let's let's play a little gender reversal here. If the gender roles were reversed and a civilized, educated woman marries a man who acts like Kate does, would that be considered acceptable? It also would, right? We know this because, again, the storytellers like Boccaccio write stories about men who behave like Kate did. And they're mocked, they are derided, they are considered to be antisocial. So, there are ways to refute authority that are socially acceptable, and then there are ways that are just obnoxious. So the question is, are Kate's in her initial behavior, would we find that acceptable from anyone of any gender? Not really. I mean, throwing furniture out windows. I mean, I get it. I mean, Rage Against the Machine, baby, do it. And the machine is terrible, absolutely. But there is something to the statement that you attract most likely. That being said,
Exactly. Yeah, she does say horrible things, and yeah, she says horrible things. And she's nasty in the beginning, and nobody finds that pleasant from anyone. And it's the other extreme from Bianca, who's completely submissive, and she says, "I'll just go and read my poetry and play my instruments, and whatever you say, Daddy." And so you see the two different takes on it, and of course, uh, Katerina is, horribly nasty, and I can't imagine that being acceptable by anybody. Yeah. So I tell you what, we've been talking a long time, and I just want to see if we can wrap it up for the sake of keeping the video not too awfully long. And do you have any advice for the audience if they're wondering, this is a scary play, I don't get it? Like, would you have any advice for them in a short kind of bullet point for reassuring them that this is a moment in history?
Yeah, so watch the play try to watch it from a 16th century mindset, but also keeping in mind that what you're watching was very progressive. um, appreciate that, and understand that um, what we consider appropriate and acceptable now just changes all the time. And that shouldn't take the value away. We shouldn't therefore ignore all literature that is uncomfortable to us. Sometimes maybe being a little uncomfortable is okay. But remember what was acceptable, what could be acceptable treatment of women, and it could have gotten a lot worse for Katerina, a lot worse in this play. And Shakespeare purposely chose not to. So maybe view it as the progressive Reformation tale and comedy that it is, and just enjoy it. It's, I know that can be hard and it can be triggering, but it's comedy. It's a comedy, and it tells the story of a woman who's raging against the machine, and she finds a better way to do it at the end. So actually, from that perspective, it's a tale of, in my opinion, it's a tale of a woman's triumph over the system. Right? She makes the system work for her instead of, trying to break a system that isn't going to break.
I like that. Oh, Judith, thank you. That's a great piece. Very nice summary. She does make the system work for her because in the end, she makes Petruchio win the bet at the end, and he gets a whole ton of money out of this wager he made on her. And the two other guys lose a bunch of money, and her father gives him 20,000 crowns more because a new daughter who is much more amiable, and everybody wins.
Pragmatic, 100% pragmatic.
Thank you so much.
So, there was incentive for her to change her behavior. He paid her to change her behavior.
Exactly. Okay, Judith, thank you so much. I'll wrap up the recording here, and we're going to post this and help people see a little more of the historical context of the Taming of the Shrew so that they can learn more as well as get to watch a really fun Shakespeare show. So we're going to end the recording, and thank you.
Thank you. It's been a